Year 1943, the skies over Europe are burning. Every morning, American B-17s rise into the grey dawn like metal saints, carrying young men with trembling hands and silent prayers. They know the odds. 1 in 4 won't return. Enemy flak fills the sky like black blossoms of death. Fighters scream through the clouds, tearing into formation after formation. The airmen's bodies are as vulnerable as the thin aluminum skin of their bombers. But somewhere far from the chaos of the front lines, in a quiet military hospital in England, one man watches the casualty reports with growing fury. His name is Dr. Malcolm McCulloch, a U.S. Army surgeon. Day after day, he cuts open shattered airmen, men torn apart not by bullets, but by fragments of steel and shrapnel that pierce their chests and guts. The same pattern, the same agony again and again. And one night, under the dim light of an operating tent, something inside him breaks. If the brass won't protect these men, he will. In secret, he begins to design something the Air Force never asked for. A vest made not of cloth or leather, but steel. A crude, heavy thing that might just defy death itself. The military calls it unauthorized. McCulloch calls it necessary. What began as one surgeon's act of rebellion would go on to save thousands of bomber crew lives. Every mission over Europe was a gamble with fate. The young men who climbed into the bellies of those B-17 bombers knew it, even if they didn't say it aloud. They smoked in silence, grinned for photographs, or scribbled quick letters home, pretending not to notice how many empty bunks were in the barracks that morning. The briefing officer's voice echoed through the cold English hangar. Target Schweinfurt, or Bremen, or some nameless patch of grey that would soon vanish beneath a storm of bombs. The crews nodded, checked their maps, their oxygen masks, their rosaries. No one mentioned the odds. When the engines roared to life, the ground trembled. The bombers lifted slowly into the dull, fog-washed sky, wings glistening with frost. From the ground they looked invincible, a formation of silver giants marching eastward. But inside, every man knew how fragile they really were. The fuselage walls were barely thicker than a few sheets of metal. You could punch through it with a screwdriver. The gunners, the bombardiers, the pilots, they all sat within reach of death, enclosed in a shell that rang like a bell when struck by shrapnel. At 20,000 feet, the cold was so severe it turned breath into snow. The sky was a vast and merciless sea of blue. And then, like clockwork, the first bursts of flak appeared. Black clouds blossomed around the bombers, expanding into dark flowers that filled the air with steel fragments. The crews called it the black snow. It fell everywhere, invisible, unpredictable, lethal. You could hear it tapping against the fuselage, like rain on tin. Sometimes it was only that tapping. Sometimes it tore through a man's body before anyone could see where it came from. The gunners gripped their handles, their eyes scanning the sky. One moment they were watching the formation, the next they were screaming for a medic. Inside the narrow compartments, there was no space for panic, only movement. Someone would press a hand to a wound, another would call out coordinates. The engines would keep roaring. The pilot couldn't stop. He had to stay in formation. Every second counted. Somewhere below, the cities of Europe burned in silence, unaware that men were dying thousands of feet above them. When the bombers limped back to their bases, they often looked like floating ghosts. Holes ripped through their wings, glass shattered, engines coughing smoke. The medics waited on the tarmac with stretchers ready. The smell was always the same: oil, cordite, blood, and fear. They'd pull men out of the turrets, the tail sections, the nose cones. Sometimes there was nothing left to pull. Those who survived were rushed to the field hospitals, thin canvas tents with operating tables made of aluminum trays. That's where Dr. Malcolm McCulloch worked. He was a tall man with sharp eyes and a calm voice, the kind of doctor who didn't waste time with words. He'd been trained to repair the human body, but the war had turned him into something else. A mechanic of broken lives. Every night he worked until his hands shook. His patients arrived wrapped in blankets, their uniforms stiff with frozen blood. Some were still conscious, mumbling about the mission, asking about their friends. Others were quiet, their faces pale beneath the oxygen masks. McCulloch learned to read the silence. He knew when a man was about to slip away even before the heart monitor flatlined. He began to notice a pattern. The wounds weren't random. They clustered around the same places: the chest, the abdomen, the ribs. Metal fragments, sometimes no bigger than a fingernail, had torn through organs that the military called non-vital in their cold reports. But to McCulloch, each fragment told a story. He'd place them in small glass jars after every surgery, labeling them with the mission name and date. Soon, his desk was covered with these little relics of destruction, pieces of the same flak that filled the skies. Each one represented a man who might have lived. If only he'd had something stronger than cloth between him and death. One evening, after another long day of surgery, McCulloch sat alone by the operating table. The tent was quiet except for the hum of a lantern and the distant rumble of engines returning from another mission. He stared at the blood-stained uniforms piled beside him. The jackets were thick, lined with padding, but useless against shrapnel. He ran his fingers over the holes, some neat and round, others jagged and torn wide. Each hole was a wound waiting to happen again. He remembered one particular patient, a 19-year-old waist gunner named Franklin. The kid had been hit by a fragment the size of a coin. It entered just below his ribs and severed an artery. By the time they brought him in, the bleeding had filled half his body cavity. McCulloch did everything he could, but Franklin died before dawn. The bulletproof vest he'd been wearing, if you could call it that, had been made of layers of canvas and silk. It might stop a splinter of wood, but not steel. That night McCulloch couldn't sleep. The sound of the bombers still echoed in his mind, their engines fading into the darkness like a heartbeat. He realized something brutal. The enemy wasn't just out there in the sky. It was in the system, in the rules, in the endless bureaucracy that told men like him what they could or couldn't do. No unauthorized modifications, the orders said. No additional armor beyond regulation weight. The brass worried about efficiency, fuel, aerodynamics. But none of that mattered to the men who died with shrapnel in their lungs. He began to think like a soldier instead of a surgeon. What if protection didn't have to mean bulk? What if a few thin steel plates, shaped to fit the torso, could absorb the impact? It wouldn't make a man invincible. Nothing could, but it might give him a chance. A single chance was worth everything. The next morning, McCulloch visited the maintenance yard where damaged bombers were stripped for parts. He walked among the wrecks. Twisted wings, shattered engines, the smell of burned oil hanging in the air. He picked up a fragment of fuselage, still warm from the torch, and felt its weight. It was thin, light but strong, steel alloy, the same kind that took hits and kept planes flying. He asked a mechanic to cut a few sheets into small curved pieces. pretending he needed them for medical equipment. Back in his tent, he began to experiment. Using canvas from discarded flight jackets, he stitched small pockets that could hold the metal plates in place. He shaped them to fit over the chest and abdomen, securing them with leather straps. The first version was crude, too heavy, too stiff, but it was a beginning. He tested it himself, strapping it on beneath his uniform and bending, twisting, adjusting. It felt awkward but solid, like wearing a second skin of steel. A week later, one of the gunners volunteered to test it. They hung the vest on a wooden frame and fired a standard round at it from 10 paces. The bullet struck with a loud crack and didn't pass through. The men stood in silence, staring at the small dent in the metal. McCulloch picked up the vest, ran his finger over the mark, and smiled for the first time in months. It had worked. He began making more, quietly and carefully. His surgical assistants helped after hours, pretending they were stitching bandages. They used scrap steel from the wreck yard, shaping it with hammers and heating it over small stoves. Each vest was slightly different, some heavier, some lighter, but all were built with the same purpose. The airmen who received them didn't ask too many questions. They called it Mac's vest, a small miracle from the man who'd seen too much death to care about permission. As more bombers returned from missions, something unexpected happened. The men wearing McCulloch's vests began surviving wounds that used to be fatal. Shrapnel that would have pierced their lungs now left only bruises. Bullets that once tore through their chests were stopped cold. Word spread quietly among the squadrons. The doctor had found a way to cheat death. Some of the pilots started coming to him before missions, asking if they could borrow one. There were never enough to go around. McCulloch's superiors eventually found out. They summoned him to headquarters, accused him of violating orders, of wasting materials, of endangering aircraft performance. He stood there, listening in silence as the officers lectured him about protocol. When they finally asked for an explanation, he said only one thing: "If it saves one man, it's worth it." They didn't punish him, not officially, but they warned him to stop. Of course, he didn't. He couldn't. In the months that followed, he kept refining the design, lightening the plates, improving the stitching. Each new version was a little better, a little more comfortable. He watched from the field hospital as bomber groups came home with fewer casualties. He never told anyone how many vests he'd made. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. To the men who wore them, McCulloch's invention wasn't just armor. It was hope. Hope that maybe they'd see another sunrise, another letter from home, another mission completed. And in a war where death was always overhead, hope was the rarest thing of all. The orders were clear: no additional gear, no unauthorized equipment, no experiments. Every ounce of extra weight meant less fuel efficiency, less altitude, less chance of returning home. The Air Force bureaucracy was built on precision, on numbers, on regulations written far from the blood-soaked runways of England. But Dr. Malcolm, McCulloch didn't see numbers. He saw faces. He remembered the trembling hands of the gunners, the way the pilots looked away when he walked into the ward. They all knew him as the man who cut into the living and closed the eyes of the dead. The brass could talk about efficiency all they wanted. McCulloch had seen what that efficiency cost. He worked in secrecy, not out of arrogance, but desperation. His field hospital was little more than a collection of tents stitched together with willpower. The walls shook when the bombers took off at dawn. There was no time for comfort, just the endless rhythm of surgery and silence. And yet, beneath the chaos, something extraordinary was taking shape. After his shifts ended, when the lights were dimmed and the camp slept, McCulloch and his small team of nurses and orderlies transformed the operating tent into a workshop. They gathered scrap metal from wrecked bombers, stolen in small pieces so no one would notice. The mechanics turned a blind eye. Some even helped, quietly slipping him leftover sheets of steel alloy. The sound of hammering echoed softly through the night. Sparks flew as they bent the metal over makeshift molds, curving it to fit the human chest. McCulloch's hands, used to holding scalpels, now held hammers and welding tongs. His white surgical coat became stained with soot and oil. The transformation wasn't just of material, it was of purpose. The first vest was heavy, too heavy. When he strapped it to his torso, he could barely move his arms, but he refused to stop. He sketched designs on the backs of medical charts, adjusting the shape, the curvature, the spacing of the plates. He discovered that overlapping thin layers of steel could distribute impact better than a single thick one. It wasn't beauty he was after, it was survival. And survival was an ugly, brutal craft. Word of the doctor's project spread quietly among the airmen. Some laughed. A steel vest sounded ridiculous, like wearing a tin can to a gunfight. But others came to see it, curiosity shining in their tired eyes. McCulloch showed them the prototypes, rough hand-stitched, patched together from canvas and salvaged straps. The men ran their fingers over the dents and scratches left from his tests. He'd fired into them himself with a sidearm, the impact leaving small, perfect craters but no holes. The first to wear one into battle was a tail gunner named O'Reilly, wary, freckled, with the grin of a man who didn't believe in luck. He was due for his 23rd mission and wanted every edge he could get. "If this thing slows me down, I'll dump it mid-flight," he told McCulloch, strapping it over his flight jacket. The surgeon said nothing, just adjusted the straps and nodded. That afternoon, the sky over France exploded with flak. When O'Reilly's bomber returned, one engine was gone and the fuselage looked like a sieve. But O'Reilly walked off the plane with a small dent in his vest where a piece of shrapnel had struck. Without it, the fragment would have pierced his heart. He held up the vest like a trophy, the steel bent inward but intact. "Guess your contraption works, Doc," he said, his grin shaking with disbelief. From that day on, airmen came in secret. They brought whiskey, chocolate, cigarettes, anything they could offer, just to get one of McCulloch's vests. He didn't keep count, didn't take names. Every piece he made was slightly different, adjusted to the wearer's body, stitched with quiet urgency. His nurses helped cut the canvas, their fingers raw from the work. The sound of sewing machines hummed beside the clatter of surgical instruments. It was a rebellion disguised as compassion. But rebellion never goes unnoticed for long. One morning, an officer from command visited the hospital. He'd heard rumors, whispers of illegal modifications, and unauthorized projects. McCulloch was summoned to explain himself. Standing before a panel of officers, he felt the familiar chill of bureaucracy, the polished desks, the smell of ink and leather, the faces of men who had never seen the inside of a bomber. They lectured him about discipline, about rules, about the importance of obedience in wartime. When they finished, McCulloch didn't argue. He simply took one of his vests from a crate and placed it on the table. Then, without a word, he produced a pistol, aimed it at the vest, and fired. The shot echoed through the room. Smoke drifted upward. When the officers looked closer, they saw the bullet had flattened against the steel, leaving only a shallow dent. McCulloch said quietly, "That dent is the difference between a living man and a dead one." They didn't arrest him. They didn't endorse him either. They dismissed him with a warning: cease production immediately. But by then, it was too late. The vests were already spreading through bomber groups like a secret weapon of faith. Airmen shared them between missions, passed them down to new crews. They called them McCulloch shells, belly armor, or simply the doctor's miracle. The next morning, McCulloch visited the maintenance yard where damaged bombers were stripped for parts. He walked among the wrecks. Twisted wings, shattered engines, the smell of burned oil hanging in the air. He picked up a fragment of fuselage, still warm from the torch, and felt its weight. It was thin, light but strong, steel alloy, the same kind that took hits and kept planes flying. He asked a mechanic to cut a few sheets into small curved pieces, pretending he needed them for medical equipment. Back in his tent, he began to experiment. Using canvas from discarded flight jackets, he stitched small pockets that could hold the metal plates in place. He shaped them to fit over the chest and abdomen, securing them with leather straps. The first version was crude, too heavy, too stiff, but it was a beginning. He tested it himself, strapping it on beneath his uniform and bending, twisting, adjusting. It felt awkward but solid, like wearing a second skin of steel. A week later, one of the gunners volunteered to test it. They hung the vest on a wooden frame and fired a standard round at it from 10 paces. The bullet struck with a loud crack and didn't pass through. The men stood in silence, staring at the small dent in the metal. McCulloch picked up the vest, ran his finger over the mark, and smiled for the first time in months. It had worked. He began making more, quietly and carefully. His surgical assistants helped after hours, pretending they were stitching bandages. They used scrap steel from the wreck yard, shaping it with hammers and heating it over small stoves. Each vest was slightly different, some heavier, some lighter, but all were built with the same purpose. The airmen who received them didn't ask too many questions. They called it Mac's vest, a small miracle from the man who'd seen too much death to care about permission. As more bombers returned from missions, something unexpected happened. The men wearing McCulloch's vests began surviving wounds that used to be fatal. Shrapnel that would have pierced their lungs now left only bruises. Bullets that once tore through their chests were stopped cold. Word spread quietly among the squadrons. The doctor had found a way to cheat death. Some of the pilots started coming to him before missions, asking if they could borrow one. There were never enough to go around. McCulloch's superiors eventually found out. They summoned him to headquarters, accused him of violating orders, of wasting materials, of endangering aircraft performance. He stood there, listening in silence as the officers lectured him about protocol. When they finally asked for an explanation, he said only one thing: "If it saves one man, it's worth it." They didn't punish him, not officially, but they warned him to stop. Of course, he didn't. He couldn't. In the months that followed, he kept refining the design, lightening the plates, improving the stitching. Each new version was a little better, a little more comfortable. He watched from the field hospital as bomber groups came home with fewer casualties. He never told anyone how many vests he'd made. He didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. To the men who wore them, McCulloch's invention wasn't just armor. It was hope. Hope that maybe they'd see another sunrise, another letter from home, another mission completed. And in a war where death was always overhead, hope was the rarest thing of all. By the final months of the war, the skies over Europe looked like scars that refused to heal. The bombers still flew, the missions still launched, but something had changed. The men who climbed into those aircraft carried with them more than their courage or their prayers. They carried the silent protection of one man's defiance. McCulloch's steel vests had spread across squadrons like a whispered legend. No orders had approved them, no manuals had recorded them, yet they became as essential as oxygen masks to the men who wore them. They were a secret promise that maybe, just maybe, someone out there actually cared if they lived. Every vest bore the marks of its maker, rough edges, uneven stitching and dents from testing. They were far from perfect. The steel sometimes pinched in the cold. The straps dug into the shoulders during long flights, but the airmen didn't complain. To them, those imperfections were part of its soul. Each vest carried a story. One man's rebellion against a system that measured lives in numbers instead of names. McCulloch rarely left the hospital grounds anymore. He had grown thinner, his face pale from months without sleep. The war had taken more from him than he admitted. But every time a bomber squad returned intact, he would step outside the tent, look toward the horizon, and listen for the engines. If he heard the familiar low rumble of B-17s returning, he'd close his eyes and exhale the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He never asked who made it back wearing his armor. It didn't matter. The sound of landing gear touching the earth was answer enough. One morning, a young pilot named Harris came to see him. His vest was dented, the fabric torn. He placed it on McCulloch's table with a trembling hand. "Flak hit us dead center," he said. "Knocked me out cold for a second. When I came to, the whole crew thought I was dead." He tapped the dent in the steel plate, deep as a fist. "Guess you were watching over us, Doc." McCulloch didn't reply. He just ran his fingers over the dent, feeling the cold metal and the faint warmth left by the man's body heat. That tiny crater represented everything he had fought for. There were others like Harris, dozens, then hundreds, crewmen with bruised ribs instead of punctured lungs, bombardiers who came home with cracked plates instead of folded flags. Word spread not through official reports, but through whispers shared in mess halls, airstrips, and hospital wards. "Wear the doc's vest," they'd say. "It's heavy, but it keeps you breathing." Eventually, the higher-ups could no longer ignore it. By 1945, the Army quietly began issuing its own version of the flak vest, a mass-produced adaptation of McCulloch's design. It was lighter, standardized, stamped with serial numbers instead of fingerprints. It looked cleaner, more professional, but it lacked the soul of the originals. The Air Force never mentioned his name in connection with the design. Official histories would later call it a collective development, made possible by advances in field feedback. In the language of bureaucracy, one man's defiance became a committee's invention. McCulloch didn't protest. He never wanted fame. He had built the first vest in anger, not ambition. Recognition was meaningless compared to the lives saved. When reporters visited after the war, writing about the new miracle armor, worn by American flyers, he stayed silent, let them print their stories. The truth belonged to the men who'd felt the weight of that steel pressing against their hearts while the sky tried to kill them. After the war ended, the airfields emptied. The bombers were dismantled or abandoned, their glory fading into rust. McCulloch walked through the hangars one last time. The silence was deafening. He passed rows of stripped fuselages, the same kind of metal that had once protected his patients. It was strange how the material that killed them could also be shaped into something that saved them. He stopped beside a pile of wrecked wings, picked up a fragment and turned it over in his hands. It was light, thin, and cold. He smiled faintly. "We were made of the same stuff," he murmured. Back home, the world moved on. Veterans returned to quiet towns and new lives. Newspapers celebrated victory. Factories switched from weapons to washing machines. McCulloch tried to return to normal medicine, to operate in bright, sterile rooms instead of tents. But something inside him had changed. He could no longer see surgery as routine. It was war by other means. Every patient reminded him of the airmen he couldn't save, and every heartbeat he restored sounded like the engines of a B-17 returning from the clouds. He kept one vest with him, the very first. Its steel was dull, the canvas faded and frayed. He hung it in his study, beside his medical degrees and a single black and white photograph of a bomber crew smiling in front of their plane. Sometimes he'd run his fingers over the vest, tracing the small imperfections, the hammer marks, the stains of oil and blood. He never cleaned it. To him, it wasn't a relic of war. It was a memory of what humanity could do when compassion outweighed command. Years later, military historians would revisit the archives, piecing together scattered reports and testimonies. They found references to Dr. Mac's armor, to steel-stitched vests, to unauthorized field modifications that improved survival rates. They found no official credit, but they found evidence enough. The story resurfaced quietly in lectures and footnotes, then in museums. A few surviving vests were displayed behind glass, labeled with simple descriptions: early prototype of Flak armor, field developed by U.S. Army medical personnel 1943-44, no name attached. But those who knew whispered it anyway: McCulloch. The legacy of his defiance outlived him. The principles he discovered: layered protection, curved impact plates, flexible chest coverage, became the foundation for every form of modern body armor. From the nylon flak jackets of Korea to the Kevlar vests of Vietnam, from the ceramic plates of the Gulf War to today's composite tactical armor, the line of innovation traces back to a surgeon in a tent, hammering steel beneath a lantern's flicker. He didn't invent courage, but he gave it a fighting chance. In the decades that followed, those who had flown the bombing missions began writing their memoirs. Many spoke of McCulloch's work. Some didn't know his name, but they remembered. That doctor who gave us metal skins. One veteran described how he kept his vest for years, refusing to throw it away even after peace returned. "It reminded me that someone was looking out for us," he wrote. "We didn't have gods up there in the sky, just a doctor with steel and stubbornness." McCulloch passed away quietly in the early 1960s, long before the world fully understood what he had done. There were no headlines, no medals, just a simple funeral attended by a handful of men who had once trusted their lives to his work. One of them placed an old steel plate on his grave, a piece dented by flak, still bearing the scars of war. The inscription on the headstone read, "He healed, and he shielded." Today, in museums and airfields across the world, there are displays of bomber equipment, oxygen masks, flight suits, helmets. And somewhere, often unnoticed in the corner, sits a dull grey vest. Most visitors walk past it without realizing what it represents. But those who stop and look closely see the small, uneven welds, the hand-stitched seams, the rough craftsmanship. It doesn't look like much. Yet in that crude shell lies the story of defiance, sacrifice, and the unyielding will of a man who refused to accept that death was inevitable. Sometimes, veterans who visit these museums linger before the display. They stare at the vest for a long time, their eyes glassy with memory. Some touch the glass and whisper something only they can hear. Perhaps they remember the cold weight of steel pressing against their chest, the hum of engines overhead, the sudden shock of flak bursting too close, and the realization that they were still alive. It's said that true heroism isn't loud. It doesn't come with medals or parades. It's found in the quiet moments when someone chooses to act, even when told not to. McCulloch's defiance was never written into military doctrine, but it lives on in every vest, every soldier, every medic who dares to improvise in the face of impossible odds. His legacy isn't measured in accolades, it's measured in lives. If you listen closely on certain airfields at dawn, where restored bombers still take to the sky for commemorative flights, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of steel being hammered under a tent, the rhythmic sound of one man shaping hope with his hands. The wind carries it away, blending with the roar of engines, with the voices of those who once flew into fire believing they'd never return. But they did, because one surgeon refused to follow orders,